According to the Director of National Intelligence, Russia attacked American democracy in 2016, and the attacks continue to this day. The information the intelligence community used to draw that conclusion is classified, but today's guest uses an incredible array of open source information and data analytics to produce a sophisticated understanding of the political warfare targeting the United States. She's Caroline Orr this week on Story in the Public Square. Hello and welcome to Story in the Public Square, where storytelling meets public affairs. I'm Jim Ludis from the Pell Center at Salve Regina University. Alongside me is my friend and co-host G. Wayne Miller from the Providence Journal. Story in the Public Square is an effort to study, celebrate, and tell stories that matter. We do that by visiting each week with the best contemporary storytellers, authors, scholars, filmmakers, and journalists, really anyone using or studying narrative to explain the world we live in. This week, we're joined by a remarkable young scholar and social media phenomena. Caroline Orr is a behavioral scientist and freelance journalist who you may know on Twitter as RVA Wonk. Caroline, thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you for having me.
So, how do you describe what you do?
That's a good question. I'm still working on that. It's a sort of combination of research, journalism. I don't know that there's a word for it yet.
It's not like you began as an information warfare expert or specialist. That's not what you were studying in school. You're finishing up a PhD in
behavioral science.
Behavioral science, but you stumbled upon something happening in social media in the context of the 2016 campaign, right?
Right.
Walk us through that a little bit.
So, the way that I sort of took my my education, which is would not typically lead me down this route. I study human behavior. One of my previous graduate degrees is in psychology, so I'm used to studying how human minds work and how humans function in social situations. And so what I have been trying to do, and I'm continuing to try to do, is apply that to the online world. Do the typical theories of behavior and behavior change. Can we apply them online? Do they work? And so some of the work my colleagues and I were doing, we were just looking at things like the spread of misinformation about the Zika vaccine or the Ebola virus. And so very much not necessarily related to anything that we're encountering today, but back it would be just sort of the beginning of the primary season of the last presidential election, when we were doing some of this research, we just started to see strange things pop up. And by that I mean I would look at a hashtag cloud, which shows you, if you're looking at one specific hashtag, the cloud shows you all of the hashtags that are commonly used with that one. So it can kind of give you an idea of what people are talking about. And some of the things we were looking at, and it was a study about refugees that really was the first one that really kind of triggered in my head that something was not right here, because we were seeing these words. First of all, a lot of it was coming from Europe, and they were talking about U.S. politics, but just in a way that was different, very different than I had seen it referenced before. There was a lot of sort of fear-mongering. You would see words like AR-15 and rape and Donald Trump, sort of clustered together in this one hashtag, meaning that they were being referenced by the same people in the same conversations. And I started to notice this over and over, and so then I started to really dig into it and realize that this was not just a fluke, that this was something weird. And then at the time, I still didn't know exactly what I was seeing. It took me a little while.
Were you sort of politically active at that time? Do you consider yourself a political person, or was this just natural curiosity that drove you?
At that time, I mean, I've always voted. I've always been a little bit, probably more than the average person, but nothing like I am today. I mean, at that point, believe it or not, I did not even have my own Twitter account at that point.
Well, you grew it fast.
So, I was an engaged voter, but it was not the interest necessarily in politics that drove it. It was the, what is going on here and what am I seeing? Because the other thing was I would sometimes stay up. I functioned being a graduate student at 3 o'clock in the morning, and I would see these hashtags on Twitter go from nothing, no tweets to 5,000 to 8,000, in a span of a really short period of time. It just wasn't natural, and it wasn't
normal social media activity in your view.
Right, and especially, at 3 o'clock in the morning, this random, it wasn't like it was a hashtag that was associated with an event. I mean, that, it has.
But 3 o'clock in the morning, so that's sort of significant, right? Because I'm completely now plagiarizing stuff that I've read you write, right? But it's because this is the off hour for the mass of East Coast American internet users, right? So is it easier at those hours to make something trend?
So it's easier to make something trend, to break through. And so if you think about the purpose of using an automated account, a bot, is you want to make it look organic.
Right.
Because once people figure out something is automated,
we don't like being manipulated.
Right. Yeah. That takes a lot of the appeal away. So the whole purpose is to make it seem like it's organic. So if you can, at 3 o'clock, 4 o'clock in the morning, use bots to amplify a hashtag enough to get it boosted, get it trending, get other people, anybody who's on Twitter to notice it, start using it, then get picked up by, real users, not bots. Yeah. Then by the time most people are waking up, that hashtag's going to be trending, but by then it's going to be actual users who are tweeting the hashtag as opposed to the bots that were tweeting it several hours ago and getting it, into eyesight.
So at this early stage, how were you analyzing this? Was it you simply surfing through Twitter accounts and social media, or did you use other, more sophisticated tools than that?
A combination of both, and honestly, that's still, to a large degree, the answer is a combination of both.
Really?
Because there's still, there's not necessarily one tool that really captures it all or that does it all, and some of Twitter is notoriously hard to get. To get data from for right, for individual researchers. Some of what we were doing initially when we first started to see these things, we were really doing what would be considered qualitative content analysis, where we would come up with a code book, download several thousand tweets, and we would go through and code them, and coding for sentiment and things like that. And over time, then started to use more analytics software, and even just some of the tools that are available right there on Twitter. For example, like the engagement rate.
So it was an evolutionary process. So this was early in the primary, and as the primaries continued and then were resolved, and then we had the general election, it became clear to you that Russia was somehow behind some of this. Talk about that.
So I can't exactly remember when the first, inklings of discussion sort of, publicly came out that, this may have traces of Russia in this, and I think it was initially related to WikiLeaks, DNC, and then immediately, when it first started coming out, sort of immediately clicked that that's what this is. I mean, it was just too characteristic in terms of some of the conspiracy theories and just sort of the way the the manipulation was occurring. It wasn't just what Donald Trump would refer to as fake news. It was disinformation. It was more insidious, and really, as the presidential election then really got started and moved from the primaries into the general election, it was, I can't even explain quite the feeling of seeing it, but it was like this, watching a train wreck, because you knew what was happening, and I wasn't the only one, but there were some of us just sort of screaming, trying to get people to pay attention, and even some really good journalists who I still would hold in high regard just really missed some of the these really key points and red flags. Like if you're getting these leaks, kids, you need to be considering who your source
Well, you
is.
think about the number of outlets that either on their front page in print or their front page, their homepage online, had the daily update from WikiLeaks. And there was a whole raft of national security professionals in the middle of 2016 saying, WikiLeaks is a suspect source, right? There was already suspicion about their relationship with Russian intelligence.
Well, I wonder if the media, being slow to really pick up on that, they certainly have since the election, had to do with the fact that Julian Assange initially was seen as sort of a hero.
Right.
And so perhaps that was in the mindset of people who were privy to this information that you had and didn't necessarily write or react the way they should have. So the question of the hour is, did Russia sway the 2016 election?
The way that I look at it, because I do get asked that question quite frequently, is we don't know, and probably will never know how many votes might have been changed or how many minds might have been changed. But the way I look at it is that if any of this changed one person's mind, whether it was to switch candidates or more likely just not to vote at all, because that was the likely
Voter suppression.
Right. That seems the most likely way to change someone. If it affected one person and impacted one person and made them stay home when otherwise they would have voted, to me, that means you impacted the election. Maybe you didn't swing the outcome, although I think it's possible that it did.
Well, I think we can safely say more than one person reacted the way one of those two ways.
Yeah.
Voted for a certain person or didn't vote.
So the question I have at this point, though, is did the Russian effort in social media stop after the 2016 election?
That was a no.
That was a definite
For our radio
no.
audience, that was a definite no.
It has become more sophisticated in some ways. One of the things that I try to talk about in some of what I write is that we think of manipulation and disinformation as things that are put out there, like the fake news, and it's really a two-way street, though, in that they're constantly collecting information, learning about us, learning about our habits, learning about what makes us respond a certain way, and if they want to get a certain response from us, they need to learn what type of information or what type of profile will get it. So a lot of what I have seen, at least in the past year or so, 6 months to a year, seems to have been a lot of that sort of what I call fishing expeditions, and sort of seeing, you know, what can we learn about you? And
I mean, it's almost like a social behavior experiment for them. You conduct an experiment, you draw conclusions, and you prove or disprove a hypothesis. I mean, this is your line of work.
From an operational perspective, now you've done test runs, and this is something that Soviet intelligence used to do in the Cold War par excellence. They didn't put something in the field until they were confident it was going to work.
I think this is a really important point that is often overlooked in this whole discussion. I mean, it's sort of like the critical other half of disinformation, quote unquote.
So what does this portend for the midterm, for the elections in November of 2018?
Well, I think one thing we know for sure is we can count on, you know, this continuing. We can count on there being efforts to manipulate, probably across social media platforms and, you know, into mainstream media. I think there are better defenses, but at the same time, you know, like we were just talking about, Russia has learned, you know, they have learned how to get around already some of the defenses that we're setting up. And one of the things I think, you know, ultimately it's going to come down to individuals being prepared, individuals learning, you know, what to look out for, and also, you know, we really do need some leadership here in terms of, you know, there's a lot of people, and this is one thing that I consistently find, there's a lot of people who are, you know, perfectly willing and happy almost to see some of these efforts because they're aimed at helping Donald Trump, and people think that's okay.
They need to put party or country
I think
over
there's no
party.
question that leadership is needed because, you know, you study this, and I see it empirically in my own life and with my business associates and friends. A lot of people begin the day with social media, they want to connect with friends. They're not doing an analysis, you know, pro or con. They're just kind of looking at things, but information comes across. Well, if someone isn't clearly saying what you've been saying, sounding an alarm, as it were, it's very easy to just kind of go, oh. And then you have a conversation with a friend. Did you know? And I mean, I've seen this repeatedly on things that are true and things that aren't true.
And it plays to our confirmation biases. Right?
Yes,
so,
absolutely.
So we see something that we want to see, it confirms what we already believe, bam, hit retweet. But you just did a deep dive on a social media campaign called #WalkAway. And so for the innocent among us, right, first maybe explain,
that includes me too.
Explain what astroturfing is.
Okay, well, astroturfing is a term that comes from you know, traditional political campaigning, so not just limited to the digital online world, but it's basically where you are manufacturing an appearance of support. So, you know, maybe a candidate isn't that popular or an idea isn't that popular. So astroturfing as opposed to, you know, real
grassroots.
Exactly. Yeah. And so online, it's a lot easier to do this, to get away with astroturfing, to get away with manipulating the appearance of support, because you don't have to, you know, manipulate an actual objective reality. You just have to manipulate this, you know, online shared information space, which is a lot easier, you know, to make it look like there's 10,000 people than to actually put 10,000 people in a room. This particular movement was a kind of played on a theme that we've seen pop up in the past year and a half of Democrats walking away from the party. So the whole idea was that there were all of these social media users who were former Democrats saying that they were walking away from the Democratic Party because of XYZ. And there were some, you know, pretty prominent themes in there. And using the hashtag #WalkAway. And so when I looked at it, I mean, the first thing that caught my eye was just, it looked really scripted. And then
What do you mean by that? It looked scripted. How could you tell? What were the telltale signs?
Well, so some of the answers that people were giving in terms of why they were walking away from the party, if you step back and think about it, these were people who were claiming they'd been Democrats for, decades, and I voted for Obama, and I voted, for Bill Clinton, and now I'm walking away and I'm supporting Donald Trump because, Democrats are divisive, or because, what were some of the other?
They were mean to Sarah Huckabee Sanders.
Yeah, they were mean. Or Maxine Waters called for, protests, and just the idea that a Democrat of 30 years is going to suddenly walk away and start supporting Donald Trump
because the Democrats are mean.
Right,
yeah.
And divisive was just, it just didn't pass the smell test. And then when I started looking at it further, that's where I looked at these engagement rates, which is a way of seeing sort of how many people relative, so, a person with a large Twitter following is a little bit different, but for the average Twitter follower or Twitter user, an engagement rate in the single digits somewhere is about average. So that's telling you ratio of Twitter followers to how many people are interacting with a specific tweet, so retweeting, likes, comments. And these walkaway tweets had engagement rates of like 500%, 1,000%, 3,000%. I mean, just, I had never seen numbers like that before, and it wasn't just one or two. It was most of them, and so that's the kind of thing that's what makes me then keep looking,
dig deeper.
Yep.
So who was behind this?
So I can't even remember the guy's name now. Brandon something. He's publicly he's not hiding that he started it or anything, and again, this is where you get into that gray area of he did an interview on RT, which is one of Russia's
formerly Russia Today. It's a
right.
propaganda outlet, English
right.
language. Yeah,
and there was definitely involvement in terms of Russia's sort of grasping onto that narrative and pushing it. It's hard to say in a lot of these circumstances, was there any sort of overlap in terms of, Russia obviously reached out and had him on RT, and, probably would have loved to promote the hashtag as much as possible. I don't know if there was any sort of, reciprocal effort, and that's the case with a lot of these. Russia will definitely seize on anything that they can, and the reciprocal nature, that's a little bit harder to tell, but you can pretty much count on if there's something divisive out there, it's probably yeah.
So if you so there's a pushback on some of this, right? Which is that. Well, I'm not going to mention any names, but I've seen U.S. senators make the case that, look, the whole world meddles in everybody else's elections. And this is just the information environment we operate in. Get over it. How do you respond to that?
So I guess I'd have a couple different responses. One is that I think the idea that, we interfere in other countries' elections on par with, or in any way equivalent to what Russia did to us is just, to me, sort of a non-starter. We interfere because we want other countries to have elections.
Right.
We don't
free elections.
Right,
at that.
free
yeah.
elections. We don't try to stop other countries from electing their leaders of choice. We try to allow them to do that, and in terms of the idea that this is just the information environment we're in. Certainly there are, issues where free speech and freedom of information does come into play, and I would never, I tend to err on the side of, not restricting the information itself, and being, more, I'd advocate more for solutions that start with us as opposed to the platform. Because yes, it is true that this is the information environment we're living in, but it doesn't necessarily have to be. And these are, in terms of things like bots, these are private platforms. A bot doesn't have a right to free speech. A bot is not a person. And that's where I think there is room for some, what they would probably call censorship. But
So quickly, because we're almost out of time, having said all this and lacking clear leadership, what would you say to the average person who is on social media, and that's pretty much all of us at this point, to be wary of this and to be more thoughtful? What would your advice be?
In about 10 seconds.
Think critically before you share something, and consider who might be benefiting from you sharing that.
Good advice.
Caroline Orr, thank you so much for being with us. She's Caroline Orr. You want to follow her on Twitter at RVAWonk. That's all the time we have this week. But if you want to know more about Story in the Public Square, you can find us on Facebook and Twitter, or visit pellcenter.org, where you can also catch up on previous episodes. He's Wayne, I'm Jim. We hope you'll join us again next week for more Story in the Public Square.